Stragglers. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, which is an amalgamation of Grand Rounds, which I'm the chair and organizer of, and one of the DCAT organized lectures that go through the year. My name's Tom Farden. I'm a chest physician here in NHS Tayside, and I chair and organize the Grand Rounds program that runs through all of the year. We dip in and out of guest lectures, and we can join forces with DCAT at various occasions to co-host this sort of endowed named lecture. We are blessed with a full ground floor in this auditorium, at least today, which is the most full I've seen it for some time. So thank you very much for those of you who come in person. We're also on Teams, and you can probably just hear the pinging in the background of people joining the room. I'll try and fiddle around with the settings in a second. So there are more people in the background who are here on Teams. And then this will go onto YouTube on our Grand Round channel so that you can come back to it, or if you're watching on YouTube, see it for the first time. This is the Douglas G. Adamson Memorial Lecture. Our guest speaker is going to introduce who Douglas G. Adamson was, why we're here, and why and what the history is. But I would just mention that some of Douglas Adamson's family are here on the front row today. So thank you very much for coming along to this. We're really grateful for you being here, and we're to honour the family name. So our speaker today is Professor John Dillon, who I've known for about as long as anybody in this institution. I've been blessed to be interviewed by him for my consultant job, which was a joy, I remember. But also I've worked as a registrar with and under him, and as a fellow consultant alongside him for the last 10 or 15 years. John has given Grand Round presentations numerous times before. His last Grand Round presentation done during lockdown on alcoholic liver disease, which became a massive problem during lockdown, is one of our most viewed Grand Rounds on YouTube. And if you've not seen it, it's well worth going back to watch that. But John is well known across the country, the world, as being a leader in hepatology. He's going to speak about the thing in which he is undoubtedly a world expert, and that is hepatitis-C virus. He's spoken before about making Dundee the first hepatitis-C-free city in the world, and he's going to speak today that all good stories need research and a pirate.
Thank you very much for the honour of delivering this lecture and being invited to step back and review what Tayside has done over the 25 years that we've been tackling hepatitis C. It's an honour to give the Douglas G. Adamson Memorial Lecture, particularly with his family in the front row and his daughter online. Dougal told me I had to say that. But hopefully this is a lecture that Douglas would have enjoyed and would have been part of if he's still with us. I want to talk particularly about hepatitis C. I'm going to review what we've done over the 20 years together as a team. I'm not going to talk about my other research activities, etc. So I'm going to tell the story. For those of you who follow YouTube, there's a guy called the History Guy who always starts his broadcasts with a historical theme about all good stories need a pirate. I've stolen his title. This is Douglas Adamson in his two guises. He is a Dundee boy, born and bred. He went to school in the Morgan Academy and graduated from this medical school when it was part of St Andrews. He's slightly annoying. Basically, he was good at everything he did. Won the prizes, etc. And graduated in 1938 from this medical school, went to do house jobs in Sunderland and was entering general practice in Sunderland when World War II came along. He volunteered for service in the Royal Army Medical Corps as a second lieutenant, which is the standard grade for entering. Within 4 years, he was a lieutenant colonel, became the Army's leading expert on malaria in Burma and through the Middle East, an astounding and outstanding contribution at that time. When he returned to civilian life, he became a clinical assistant here in Dundee Royal Infirmary and became a lecturer and then became a consultant here and moved across from the academic stream to the NHS. It is fitting that we've just celebrated the 50th anniversary of this hospital. He was largely responsible for chairing the committees that designed. All right. Technical hitch.
Sorry. It's me. It's
Yeah. So to continue while we're waiting for the slides to come around, he chaired the committees that designed this hospital. So the building that we're in at the moment is largely his legacy. And this is him showing the Queen Mother around when she came to open the hospital. And we celebrated that opening a few weeks ago, its 50th anniversary. I think the key thing in one of his obituaries that was written about him was his appreciation of the application of the academic component of medicine to the realities of medical practice and the way that the NHS and university should work together. And I think that's a theme that hopefully this lecture would have made him proud of. So let's talk about in the beginning. This is a phylogenetic tree of hepatitis C. If we take it back, it probably happened about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago that the hepatitis C virus jumped from an animal into man. For a long time, we believed it was the horse because the equine hepatitis virus is most closely related to hepatitis C. They've now done phylogenetics on the horse, and it only entered the horse 1,000 years ago. So it wasn't the horse, which my stories of Nubian cavalrymen charging through the deserts of East Africa have all now been kiboshed, and I can't tell those stories anymore. It was probably a bat, and we've seen what that did to us before, or may have been a rodent. But sometime in the Bronze Age, hepatitis C entered humans. There has been independent development in East Africa and the Southeast Asia, and we're unsure which was the original site. And we know there were trade routes in the Bronze Age between those two areas. There is work that I'm talk about that I might have time at the end that will maybe shine some light from projects we're doing in Ethiopia at the moment. But that's the thing. 7 genotypes on this chart. The 8th genotype was described 4 months ago. I've not changed the chart. There are only 6 cases of it so far. We'll find out more as it goes along. But those are the subtypes that we need to think about. So let's introduce our pirate. Jimmy is from Arbroath. He is 13, it's 1942, he's fed up with school, there's exciting things happening. He lies about his age, he joins the Merchant Navy, and he's on a freighter. Now, there's a bar of chocolate, another young able seaman. Jimmy gets into a fight, and the captain is not best pleased with him. So Jimmy is hanging over the side of a ship with a large scrapey broom to take the salt crust off the ship while it's in the Mediterranean, okay? He is underage, therefore he shouldn't be on the ship. He has committed an act of violence and probably stolen a chocolate bar, which under international law makes him a pirate because he's illegally aboard the ship. So he's leaning over the side of the ship, scraping off the salt, and he sees a large metallic object floating in the Mediterranean Sea just by his ship. He calls his shipmates, and I will leave you with that cliffhanger, and we'll tell you what happened to Jimmy later. So, end of the Second World War, we term hepatitis A and hepatitis B. This is infectious hepatitis as was and serum hepatitis as was. So Douglas Adamson would have been familiar with the term hepatitis A and hepatitis B. 1967, Baumgarten discovers the Australia antigen, so we have a diagnostic test for hepatitis B, so we then get hepatitis non-A, non-B. And in 1989, what we knew to be a non-A, non-B hepatitis, as a lawyer some 15 years later reminded me, because I wrote it about a patient who was then suing the NHS for it, was a transfusion-related hepatitis. It was a mild illness. It caused some persisting abnormalities of LFTs in a few patients, but didn't seem to have any serious consequences. And Michael Houghton and colleagues then discovered the gene sequence for this. And this is the first of the viruses of the. We'd never cultured it, we'd never seen it, we'd never touched it in a lab. We had its whole DNA sequence or RNA sequence from a cDNA clone, and were able to work it out. This took them 5 years to do. I'm told by some people, like Colin Palmer, that you could probably do it in 5 days now, but that's the change in technology. It's a bloodborne virus. It's not as easily transmitted sexually as HIV or hepatitis B, but it's more efficiently transmitted by dry blood. It's a disease vaccination if you have poor technique, blood transfusion. And in Northern Europe and America, it's intravenous drug use that is the main driver of infection. Clearly, in the past, it had other routes of transmission through wounds and vertical transmission from mother to child at a rate of about 5%. Okay? So, it was a mild illness. It wasn't particularly problematic. It was going to be no problem. So from that discovery in 1989, we then discovered diagnostic antibodies which were available to us by 1991. These antibodies weren't protective, but they gave us the diagnostic tests. Unsurprisingly, it was almost all transfusion-related hepatitis, which we sort of anticipated. Almost all idiopathic cirrhosis was a bit of a surprise. Oh, perhaps not so mild. And then we discovered 20% of our alcohol-related liver failure that we described to alcohol was hepatitis C infected as well. Up to 80% of people who injected drugs were infected. 1% of the Scottish population had picked the virus up from somewhere. And we then started to have the transfusion cohorts of the early 1970s starting to report their 20-year follow-up at this stage, where those that were definitely not hepatitis B had been identified, and 20% were cirrhotic after 20 years of infection, and this went up exponentially to 60% at 50%. So suddenly, this mild illness was just a slow illness, but not very mild. It was estimated at that stage that we had 180 million people infected worldwide. That was downgraded to 71 million eventually, but it still left us with 50,000 Scots infected. It was prevalent across the globe. We filled in the African part of this map. This is old. Egypt had a particular problem running at 20% of the population because of a World Health Organization vaccination program, which reused needles. And many countries that were in red, it was vaccination programs that had driven the infection and blood transfusion practices. Northern Europe and North America, the explosion of injection drug use in the 1960s and 70s had driven further expansion of that. And we started to work out what the natural history was of the infection. So acute infection was normally mild. Most people were asymptomatic. 20 to 30% of people would achieve a spontaneous cure in 6 to 12 weeks, but 80% would become chronically infected. That's in marked contrast to hepatitis B, where it's almost exactly the other way around. And once you develop chronic hepatitis, spontaneous cure was rare, and then there was slow progression over time to the process of cirrhosis, which, if you drank alcohol as well, exaggerated that rate of progression, and a higher rate of hepatocellular carcinoma than we were used to from other cirrhotic patients. So this was suddenly a very serious illness. If we think about the care pathways and what we were trying to do in terms of treatment, etc., this is the Tayside evolution of care pathways. Before 1999, we had interferon monotherapy available. It wasn't widely used. It was awful treatment to administer to patients, but we were gathering patients and knew what was going on. Between 1999 and 2004, we had the combination of pegylated interferon and ribavirin, which would achieve cure rates of perhaps 40% of patients who would require 12 months of therapy. And if you've ever had really bad flu that made your body ache and you felt dreadful, that is not the flu virus, that's interferon. So I was giving that drug to the people 3 times a week for 12 months. If I ever got sacked as a doctor, I could sell double glazing to anybody. So that's what we're offering. So in that time, we had some nursing support, which was basically to help patients through the symptoms. Between 2004 and 2009, we started to organize ourselves into managed care networks. Many of the people that we were trying to reach were those who were most disadvantaged, those who had most difficulties in accessing conventional healthcare, who were already feeling marginalized and stigmatized within society. So we had to change the way that we thought about delivering healthcare as to how we started to reach those people. And our treatment was still interferon ribavirin. Between 2009 and 2014, we started to become more organized. We got some financial support. We had further nursing input to support them. And we brought about dry blood spot testing, which changed the way we delivered diagnosis, which I'll talk about more in a moment. So that was the nature of the influence. So we had this infrastructure that was across our society that was aiming to bring people into treatment. And that is the backbone, perhaps the most important foundation stones that we laid for what I'm going to describe to you later. The Hep C treatment was evolving. So we had done the first trials on non-A, non-B hepatitis in the early 1980s. Jay Hoofnagel had led those to show us that interferon produced some cessation of abnormal ALTs within the first few years of treatment. So that was our only output. Through that era, we then pegylated in the interferon, so we only needed to give it once a week and carried on with the ribavirin. And in 2011, the arrival of the first generation of protease inhibitors, which we'll talk more about in a moment. Then we came into the second generation of DAAs, and then in 2016, we entered the era where we are now, where we have highly effective antiviral agents that can cure people. So moving it from perhaps controlling disease in 30% of patients to a cure in 97% of patients is wonderful. But what I want to emphasize is it's not necessarily about having brilliant drugs. It's how you deliver them to the people that need them most. And that is the challenge that we have to think about. So 1989, we get the gene sequence, haven't caught the virus, can't culture it, can't do anything in the lab. But by using molecular biology, we were able to create a replicon that allowed us to screen drugs. So this replicon was the molecular mechanism by which Hep C reproduced itself, and you could create that in the lab, and you could then test drugs. We'd worked out the life cycle of the virus within a few years of its discovery. It's needed 4 molecular receptors to enter the hepatocyte, and it was specific to hepatocytes because the hepatocytes had those 4 receptors on them, so elegantly refined. If we then look at the picture on your right, which is the gene sequence of the virus, which describes its structural proteins, the 3 key drug targets were the protease, the NS5A complex, and the NS5B. And we have now got inhibitors for all 3 of those targets, and they became the most successful targets. And those are the 3 classes of drugs that we use today to cure hepatitis C. Now, in 2010, this is a drug development chart. This chart, if I gave you the 2011 one, the 2012 one, and the 2013, would get progressively more complicated. And at one point, we had 70 drug or candidate drugs on those charts moving towards filing. Now, you would have thought that the ones that were in first, telaprevir and simiprevir and boceprevir, would have been the ones that would win the race. We used them clinically, but they died out. So from this chart, the drugs that won were ABT450 and ABT333, which ABBA owned, and that's now one of the backbone therapies that we use worldwide. And then this Pharmasset drug, which is sivosprevir, which Pharmasset got bought by Gilead. Gilead had 2 NS5A inhibitors that aren't even on this chart yet, that now dominate the world market. They spent £1 billion in developing the drug and getting it to market. They made it back in the first 81 days of drug sales in the US. So being first and being best, but dominating the marketplace. But that huge drug development, and we now use 5 drugs to treat all of the patients in the world, basically, and all the rest of them are now sitting on shelves, dying off, which reflects the difficulty of drug development, but the huge effort that we went through to get there. So we have the drugs and the tools. Captain James. So Jimmy spent his lifetime in the Merchant Navy, and in 2007, he turned up in outpatients to see me. And so he's now an elderly gentleman and was brought by his 2 granddaughters, who were slightly giggly, and Granddad must have been a bit of a boy in his day. You know, he's got a sexually transmitted disease, this hepatitis C, and you know, that's what's going on. So James didn't give any risk factors as to why he got the infection or what happened. hadn't been particularly a naughty boy from what he was telling me, and was just in clinic with an advanced fibrosis and significant scarring to his liver. So I got him up on the couch to examine him and discovered this huge, ugly scar on his chin. What happened there, Mr. James? That's when my face got blown off, Doc. The metal object was a sea mine, and he pushed the sea mine away from the boat with that long broom and saved the ship, but it blew up. Took off his face, and he was in a bad way. They were close to port in North Africa in 1943, arrived at port and was resuscitated by the American Army. And that part of that resuscitation involved freeze-dried plasma, which was an experimental fluid that saved hundreds and thousands of lives. But we now know from a historical cohort that a significant number of them were infected with hepatitis C, so the virus was there already. We gave him interferon ribavirin, he responded well to therapy and was cured and went back. The look on his granddaughter's face as he changed from Randy Seaman to war hero was quite spectacular. At that time, that was fairly typical of what we were doing. We were finding patients with advancing liver disease and we were curing them. And they were turning up in our outpatient clinic and we were seeing them and moving them forward. This is modelling data from Scotland based on the hepatitis C clinical database that we set up in 1994 and had been following data and collecting all the patients that we were finding in Scotland for hepatitis C. And this was the projection of what was going to happen. This was published by us in Hepatology in 2005. And that green slither in the middle was the impact treatment was going to have if we carried on doing what we were doing. We were going to make no difference. It was just going to carry on hitting us as this torrent of liver disease going forward. So we had to make a decision. Why do we treat hepatitis C? Are we thinking about preventing liver failure and hepatocellular carcinoma, which as a hepatologist, a liver doctor, that's what I'm focused on? And if so, that's going to be a perpetual program of treatment as more and more new patients are brought forward. So unless prevention is improved, unless we can think about treatment as prevention and think about moving towards an eradication agenda. And that was the ideas that we were starting to have in 2009 and 2010. And if we mapped some of that data, this was a disease of deprivation. This is mapping data we did around this time with Tom Astor-Burt. This is 20 postcode sectors in Scotland and contained 95% of the patients known to have hepatitis C at that time. It's a disease of deprivation, people that we can't reach and don't engage in healthcare conventionally. This is an empirical social network of people who inject drugs. Each dot on it is a person, each line is a sharing relationship for drugs, okay? It's Australian data, my colleague Margaret Hellard shared it. So this is Bruce, and he's Hep C positive. He shares with Sheila, okay? If we can cure Bruce before he infects Sheila, we get a sustained virological response rate or a cure for hepatitis C of 200%. Drug therapy, when it came out, was £20,000 a go. If I can use it once and cure 2 people, my managers like me. If I can't, then I'm the most expensive doctor in Tayside, even out doing Dougal and his chemotherapy agents at the time. So if we take this a step further, if this is Gary, and if we could cure Gary before he links through the rest of that network, of which there are 81 people in, that's an 8,100% SVR rate. Now, clearly, I don't have a time machine. I can't go back to catch Gary before he's the index case in that network. But if we can put enough breaks through that whole network, we could start to think about elimination of hepatitis C. Now, that idea was stimulated by an earlier version of this data, okay? It was one of those road to Damascus moments. It was a meeting in Glasgow, and my friend and colleague, David Goldberg, who's the Director of Public Health Scotland, said, I've just reviewed this paper. It's amazing modelling data that you only have to treat very small numbers of people who inject drugs, and you can change the epidemiology of it, or the modelling is great. So I said, who published it? And he said, Natasha Martin and Matt Hickman. I'm going to accept it for publication. So I emailed them. They work in Bristol. They're a modeling team. Natasha is now Professor of Biostatistics in San Diego. She is Californian, so that's why she went home. And Matt still works in Bristol, and are my collaborators. And what they were projecting was with relatively small numbers. So if you think of Tayside as having a chronic prevalence of hepatitis C amongst our people who inject drugs, it's about a 40% chronic prevalence. If you treat about 50 to 40 per 100,000 per 1,000 patients per year, which is a small number, and you have 60 to 80% coverage with needle and syringe exchanges and opiate substitution therapy for the people that need it, you will eliminate hepatitis C or get to 95% reductions within 10 years. And that's really exciting modeling. You know, if we could achieve that, if we could do that, what would we achieve? But there are challenges to think about. With treatment as prevention as an idea, society is looking for treatment and prevention of transmission. The person that you're trying to reach is not necessarily looking for that priority or for the treatment, because their disease is largely asymptomatic. They're not troubled by it yet. It's not their top priority, where getting their drug source may be the top priority in their lives and the chaos that they're living in. People you're trying to reach have experience of stigma, where they try to reach out to healthcare services and ask for help, and they are stigmatized and they're isolated from society, and they lack the confidence and have fear of engaging with those services. And treatment is going to be most effective if it's delivered to the most risky and most vulnerable patients. So it's not waiting for stabilization or behavior change. It's tackling whole groups of people at the same time, and it's accepting that you're going to get reinfection. All of which at that time, when drug treatment was £20,000 a go for an individual patient, is going to be a brave decision. A difficult one to sell to your chief executive, where you've got potentially 2,000 patients in Tayside. That's half the budget for running the health board at the time that I could have spent in one go. And then, of course, my colleagues. Treating people who inject drugs on methadone is high risk and should only be attempted in stable patients. Treating active drug users is impossible. You are dangerous, you are a pirate, said an eminent Austro-Hungarian hepatologist when I described this at a meeting. He was wagging his finger very firmly in my face at the time. But I like a bit of madness, and why can't we go one step beyond, eh? So the World Health Organization, several years later, 2015, got on the elimination bandwagon, but we were 6 years ahead of them in terms of starting to think about it. And we developed a whole series of research programs. Many people in the audience here were involved in them to answer the various questions and steps that would allow us to answer the questions as could we deliver that. And the first part of that is diagnosis, okay? If we are dealing with a population that has predominantly acquired their infection through injecting drug use, they don't have very good veins. Venipuncture is a challenge. Those of us who have practiced clinically will remember having to go into people's necks or groins to get blood, which doing that routinely in a non-clinical setting is challenging. And getting people who are skilled in venipuncture into those settings is challenging, and getting the patients from those settings to invasive clinical facilities to allow venesection or venipuncture is difficult. So I can teach anyone to get blood out of a finger, okay? And there are several people in this room who have taught hundreds and hundreds of people to get blood out of a finger. You squeeze the blood onto the card, you let it dry, you send it to the lab through the routine post if you want. The lab elutes it out and can use the same fluid to make diagnosis of hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV. And so this dry blood spot testing rollout was key, where we trained hundreds of staff across Tayside to deliver this diagnostic effort. So anyone who was engaged with people who are at risk of hepatitis C could be taught to deliver this diagnostic test until we could find the people and make a diagnosis for them. And if you can be trained to do the test, you can be trained to read the result, and you can be trained to write a letter to me to say, "Dear John, please see this person who has hepatitis C." So that was the first step. So as we rolled that out in 2009, what did it do? there's suddenly a big surge. So all the blue at the bottom of the graph is the new activity that's driven by dry blood spot testing. But it didn't divert patients away from conventional testing into dry blood spot testing. It reached a whole new population. To quote a beer advert, it reached the parts other beers couldn't reach. And that's the key thing. So we suddenly had access to a whole new population, the population that was most at risk. So that gap in our delivery. So if you see what happens to that process, this is every blood test that's ever been requested for hepatitis C in Tayside since testing began in 1991. Okay. The vast majority of them have been done in secondary care. So we've done 80,000 tests and about 1% of them have been positive. In primary care, they've done about 25,000 tests and they found about 3% positive. In the special pathways using dry blood spot testing, in addiction services, community pharmacies, needle exchange and prisons, we've done relatively few tests, but if you look at the percentage of positivity amongst that lot, we found huge numbers of patients with that pathway. If we put that into numbers, all of that activity in general practice found 1/3 of the patients. That huge amount of activity in secondary care found 1/3 of the patients, and the other 1/3 was found by those specialist pathways that we developed. So we needed all three, and we were able to demonstrate in Tayside that you needed that spread of diagnostic testing activity to find the people that you need to find. Okay. So that was diagnosis. If you found people, what do you do with them after that? So Eradicate was the 2010-2011 project where we took interferon and ribavirin. We were doing what we were told was impossible by delivering interferon and ribavirin. This is 6 months or 12 months of therapy into people in needle exchanges. So these were people who were coming to the needle exchange to pick up new needles for their injecting habit and to then leave. And we were encouraging them to have a diagnostic test with a dry blood spot test and then volunteer for testing. Now, as I said, we were asking people to do a job for society by treatment as prevention. If you're doing a job, you should be paid for it, shouldn't you? How much should you be paid for having interferon therapy for 12 months or 6 months? With protease inhibitors that have now just become available to us and we were able to get from one of the drug companies, which had a 2 to 3% chance of your skin falling off, Brian, wasn't it about that? Because you got Stevens-Johnson's reactions with these drugs. But we were achieving cure rates of 87% in the genotype 1s, where in the conventional pathways we were getting only 60%, and even higher in genotype 2s and 3s, because we were treating patients who were younger, who were fitter, and had an earlier infection. So we're actually achieving better treatment rates. So we were doing the impossible in Tayside before anyone else in the world in reaching into this community. Now, if we can do that, what else could we do? So we need to start thinking about our pathway of care. So in the interferon ages, there was risk of depression. So people had to go and see a psychiatrist. You had infectious diseases doctors and hepatologists fighting over who should be treating the patients. Here we had a joint clinic and worked together. You had pharmacists involved. You needed money for tablets. You had huge numbers of blood tests to do. Laboratory technicians and pathologists. You had to have radiological imaging. You needed large teams of nurses. And you had to have technology in terms of scanning to find patients. All of that was going to put multiple steps, 20-odd visits before someone was deemed suitable for treatment. And that would test their adherence and move them through the process. However, if you've got a spot of blood and really effective therapies, which by 2016 we're now moving into the age of the DAAs, tablets once a day for 8 to 12 weeks would get you a 97% cure rate. The drugs were extremely safe. They were entirely viral specific now with no side effects compared to those earlier ones. Could we get away with just that simple care pathway? In which case, if you had your spot of blood, the person who you were testing was coming backwards and forwards to the same site because they were picking up needles or picking up opiate substitution therapy, you could potentially treat them in place. So if we wanted to think about moving towards elimination, how many pathways did we have? So we could have the standard pathway where GPs refer to hospital doctors, you're seen in an outreach clinic, and given treatment. In drug treatment centres, we had nurses embedded there who were capable of delivering therapy, and so they could do the dry blood spot training by the addiction worker, and then the on-site nurse specialists could deliver treatment. And the same in prisons, because we already had that pathway of care developed for HIV. In needle exchanges, where people were turning up for injecting equipment and where they were most at risk, we had no pathway proven. And in the pharmacies, where people were on opiate substitution therapy who had infection and were likely to rotate backwards and forwards into injecting, we needed to reach that group. So we needed research about those two pathways as to how we were going to achieve them. So the .C program started off, led by Andrew Radley, looking at what community pharmacists could do. And we did some qualitative work to start with, and then one of the terms was used, standing outside the junkie door. In some pharmacies, they have a separate entrance for people on OST, so they don't interfere with the nice people. And the stigma that people are experiencing all the time. So stigma, discrimination, lack of confidentiality, and things need to change. And the mechanisms of the care and the burden of treatment that would be put on people if you're trying to deliver them in a pokey room in a community pharmacist with a challenge. So that would have sort of put us off things, but we did a discrete choice experiment looking at giving people who were Hep C, who preferences for Hep C testing as to what they wanted to do. Going to their own pharmacy rather than going to another pharmacy for a test, they're prepared to wait 4.5 weeks. Going to their own pharmacy rather than a GP, they'd be prepared to wait for 2 weeks. Own pharmacy rather than a drug worker, they valued equally, and to be treated with respect, they were prepared to wait 8.5 weeks, which is a stunning indictment on the services that we provide to the people that we're trying to reach. But it did suggest that it was a good relationship with the pharmacist that we could lever. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you about is using the identity and relationship of some other worker who is already engaged with the person you're trying to reach and bringing Hep C therapy through that contact. So the first study that we did was a large study, or this is one of the larger studies that we did looking at community pharmacies. So this is across Scotland, so we led it, but it also happened in Aberdeen and Grampian and Glasgow. And patients were randomized to, or the pharmacies were randomized to those that got the intervention, where the pharmacist did the dry blood spot testing, sent them off for a minimum set of blood tests. They returned and had all the rest of their treatment delivered by the pharmacist in the pharmacy, or the pharmacist directed them for treatment. And made them, signposted them to the appropriate place, and they got DAAs. And the plan was to see how many people we managed to treat. These are the outcomes. So double the number of SVRs within the pharmacy-led pathway compared to the conventional pathway. And the big step up was the numbers who were prepared to diagnose and agree to treatment in the community pharmacy when they knew they didn't have to travel anywhere else was substantially higher. Once they actually engaged in treatment, their outcomes weren't different. So if you made all the journeys to get to where you needed to have your treatment, you did well, but you lost over half your patients in that movement away from the pharmacy. So you are reaching a much larger number. So in terms of the diagnosed population cure rate, the community pharmacies were able to reach 45% of their diagnosed population, whereas those that had the conventional care pathway, we only reached 31%. So clearly we had a much better reach and much better engagement. So community pharmacies worked. Now, we were using pharmacists that could prescribe for themselves or using a patient group directive that would allow them to dispense the medication under a group directive if they could fulfill some tick boxes. In many jurisdictions across the world, that's not legal. And if your opiate substitution therapy cohort is relatively small, it's not worth training the pharmacist to deliver the treatment. If they've got 100 people to see and test, great. If they've only got 6, by the time we've trained them, the job is done. So REACH was about putting a nurse who would move through a set of pharmacies, who would sort of visit, do the testing, because most people are turning up every day for their therapy, and move through. So we did the study in Wales, in Scotland, and in Australia, where the rules were different again, and they had to get this outreach program to work. And if you looked at what happened within the pharmacies, the top line is the conventional pathway and the intervention pathways below. In the top line, 10% were agreeing to testing, and in the bottom line, 19% were agreeing to testing. They knew what the pathway was going to be like. And of those that said they would be tested, 97% got tested in the intervention pathway, only 27% in the conventional pathway where you had to go elsewhere. And again, once you got patients onto initiating therapy, they did relatively the same, but it's this big dropout beforehand in making them get to the stage of actually starting their therapy that's the key thing. So either in high volume or low volume pharmacies, it works. Now, that works for people on opiate substitution therapy because they're turning up somewhere 5 or 6 days of the week to receive their therapy, so you can co-prescribe their drug therapy with their opiate substitution therapy. In the Advanced C trial, we were looking at those patients who were in needle exchanges. So they would be coming erratically to the needle exchange to pick up needles as and when they needed them. They weren't coming every day. So how did we reach those patients? £20,000 of drug. This was more expensive than platinum gram for gram at the time we were prescribing it. What should we be doing? So the idea was directly observed therapy, which would mirror what we were doing in the community pharmacies, or fortnightly provision where you just gave them 14 days and away they went, and then with a psychological intervention. And so we did the trial, made no difference. Everyone was just as good as everyone else. And as one of the guys said to me, "Hey doc, we're professional drug takers. We can take tablets." So we had the pathways, we decided what we wanted to do. Those models had shown what we could achieve over 10 and 15-year timeframes. There was a problem. I'm now 61. I don't intend being here for another 10 years. So I wasn't going to hang around. So what if we supercharged that intervention? Rather than going for 20, 30 or 40 people who injected drugs per year, what if we went for 200, 300, 400? How about 500? It's a nice round number, isn't it? So we wanted to stage an extinction level event in Tayside, using the rest of England, the rest of Great Britain as the control population as to what treatment as normal would do. So that's what we're aiming for. So eRapid was the rapid scale-up, Epitope was the management of it all, another study. So there were 800 people with chronic hepatitis C amongst our PWID population, and we wanted to treat at least 500 of them. So we scaled up, and the idea was we'd measure the impact. These are the 6 pathways that I've shown you before, and you can see that the needle exchanges and the community pharmacists did the heavy lifting in terms of the numbers of patients that they put through treatment. So they accounted for nearly half, for just under half all of the treatments, and the other 4 pathways made up for the rest of them. So in 2 years, we delivered that number of patients who spent a year mopping up, and that was the end of the intervention. And in 2020, we were able to declare hepatitis C elimination in Tayside, that we'd hit those WHO targets that I showed you earlier on. So the idea was to get a 90% reduction in prevalence. And so how close to elimination were we? If we had a chronic prevalence of 0.5%, that would give us 1,975 patients, and 90% of that would be 1,777. We had ever diagnosed 4,312 patients. 1,000 of them were PCR negative, 700 had moved and gone somewhere else, 690 odd had died. And so we had 1,878 estimated to be alive and living in Tayside, and we have treated and cured 1,812. You'd have thought that we'd have made big news, but there was some other virus hanging around in 2020. I can't remember what it was called. Seems irrelevant now, but it also has gone away. RG. So we hit the numbers, which was great. But the issue then was it just going to come back again? Were we going to have done enough to reach treatment as prevention and elimination? So we knew from our early days, this is us in this meta-analysis down here, so in 2018, that we had a 26 to 27% per 100 patient years reinfection rate, which was huge. And if you looked at our own treatment data in the other graph, the red line was the people that we were treating in the needle exchanges, and within about 2.5 years, 50% of them were reinfected again. So we weren't achieving that level of breakthrough that we wanted. However, if you looked at it over time, as we started to do that stepping up process, so this is national data, the green line on the graph here is us. So you can see that we peaked at about 14 in this study per 100 patient years of reinfection, and then started to fall, because as we pushed on through and treated enough people, there weren't people left to reinfect people. So we went through that surge, and we predicted that we were going to have a problem with reinfection. It was going to look bad, but we thought we'd come out the other end of it. And this data started to prove that we were right in doing it. And as the other health boards started to follow our example, things started to, they were starting to see a rise. In the interest of time, I'll skip over this. This is the most recent NESI data. NESI is an anonymous testing of people who attend needle syringe provision sites across Scotland and opiate substitution sites across Scotland. And this is an anonymous survey of how many of them are positive. And so the Tayside figures are on the right over here, and you can see that by time and time, we're now down to less than 3%, and from the survey sample, that's about 6 people who are positive, and I can guarantee you that those 6 are now cured. The rest of Scotland is improving because it's starting to copy what we're doing, but clearly lagging behind. And interestingly, if you look at Tayside compared to the rest of Scotland, the prevalence of antibodies in those that have been injecting for less than 5 years is 39 to 40%. In Tayside, it's 0. So we have broken that loop of reinfection. We've stopped people coming back into the loop. So treatment as prevention works if you get it to the highest number. And this is the first place in the world to demonstrate that. For modelling data from Bristol using what we've done and where we're up to now, and they are in agreement that the model predicts that we are having less than 2 infections per year and that the virus will die out completely from our society. Clearly, there are people who are still carrying the virus, and so you will find older occasional cases. They don't have obvious risk factors, so they've not had a reason for diagnosis, and they turn up through intelligent liver function testing at a steady trickle, and we will find those people and we will treat them as well. But in terms of this being a dynamic ongoing infection, we have put an end to it. And if you look at the model projections, this is the, we are now getting to the point where we will avert 100% of the projected infections that would have happened if we hadn't intervened and delivered this intervention. We have reached a population of people who don't engage well with healthcare. We have cured them of their hepatitis C, but they stopped dying. As a hepatologist, we've cured liver disease. They're not going to die of liver disease. But then we looked at the numbers and they weren't dying of liver disease. The engagement with care and coming into contact with healthcare professionals who were focused not on their addiction but on their global health seems to be of a benefit. So if you had hepatitis C and you had it treated, you survived better than if you cured your hepatitis C spontaneously. And in a city that is the capital of the drug death capital of Europe, that's an important observation. So we're now using that linkage to care and trying to broaden out our healthcare interventions through the Cocoon project to change people's lives and to make more of that observation. So as you answer one question, you discover answers to other questions that you weren't answering. And that's where we're moving on to, and that's our next direction of travel. The pathways that we have developed are now in routine use across Australia, Canada, much of Europe. So that copying the Tayside model, and I think someone was telling me the other day that they'd come across the Washington had instituted their hepatitis C model and called it the Tayside model. So thank you, Mark Salkowski, who recognised where he got his inspiration from. We are working with the Ethiopian government and colleagues across Ethiopian medical schools to deliver health interventions in Ethiopia. Clearly, their problems are different to ours. Their injecting drug using populations are very small and are by and large not infected with hepatitis C. So we're having to come up with new ways, but using the models, using the principles of care that we developed here, we're starting to help them answer those problems. And what we've published is being moved across the globe. This is very much a team sport. The people that I've got on this list are a small number of the people that have made substantial contributions to all of this work. I am just taking the credit for them. This is part of the team, and if they misbehave, we throw them in the water. Thank you very much for listening.
turn my microphone on. That's a good start. There we go. It's rare that someone stands up and says, try again, and says, and this is the first place in the world that's done that. I was about to launch into spontaneous applause. I mean, that's an astonishing thing. I hope I'm not being overly hyperbolic, but what an astonishing thing that John and his team and the University of Dundee and the people of Dundee and everyone who's involved in that.
And NHS Tayside.
And NHS Tayside, of course, as well, to have done that. I mean, I say astonishing. I think it is absolutely astonishing work, John, and I think you should have another round of applause spontaneously for that. So there is time for questions, if anyone has questions. Right, I need to wander to you to give you a microphone, and hopefully this thing will work. I'll take this one as backup. Hello. Yes, it's all right. This is what we throw at the students during lectures, so you have to catch, okay? Well done. Speaking to the box.
Thanks a lot. Brilliant work, John. Given how well refined your model now is, because it's worked so well, can you model how much movement from outside communities into a community makes a difference? So, for example, what the challenge would be in somewhere like London?
Yeah, so we got that modelling data, and the last two slides I showed with data on it were from Bristol, and we have the rest of the modelling for the UK as to how that will model out. So, provided all of the other areas are testing frequently, you'll pick up those people that move in. And so we still have a lot of testing activity, not as much as I'd like going on, but we've got that going on, so we capture those people as they move across. Clearly in places like London, we've got a much more transitory population. They are more dependent on what other people are doing and having, you know, in terms of the rest of the country, but also the immigration in from elsewhere. So testing amongst immigrant communities is a significant issue. In Italy, where they have much more frontline immigration, they have a program of testing and are finding about 7 to 8%. For some reason, migration populations, it seems to be even higher than it is in the indigenous populations they've come from, which is surprising. There is a little stigma and a sort of some right-wing politicians have jumped on the testing initiatives amongst immigrants as a reason to debar them even more from entry as in their refugee status. So there's a political dimension to that as well, so that we have to be conscious of. But on the whole, it's about testing people as they move, and if they're coming from high-risk countries, that we need to be aware of. And that's part of maintaining elimination. But even when you reach elimination, you swap your activity from huge amounts of treatment to huge amounts of testing. And I think that's the emphasis. So it's not a complete move away from we don't ever need to worry about it. We need to carry on testing.
Dougal.
John, just astounding work. Very well done. I wondered whether you and the team had anything to teach other specialties about how to do research, because when you look at some of the hyperbole around very small increments in treatment benefit in some other specialties, the sort of change you've made is massive. So, you know, do other specialties know about the sort of all-round research you've done and the massive impact you've made?
I think we're sharing those ideas. I think it's about, you know, we have, in many specialties, we have effective drugs, but we're not necessarily thinking about how we deliver them into the communities that most need them. I mean, particularly around cardiovascular risk, where people are ignoring that. We're now starting to move that. The work that Ewan's leading around diabetes starts to help support that move where we optimize the very effective drugs you see in clinical trials into achieving the same sorts of impacts in the community. And I think that's an area that, you know, to quote your father, that integration between the university and the NHS and how we inform the development of those algorithms and plans and the efficiency with which we can translate work in clinical drug trials into effective delivery in the community so that everyone who can benefit most from the drugs gets the drugs. And from the big learning from the Hep C process was you made the diagnosis and treatment option the easier thing to do rather than, you know, the harder thing to do, because in many aspects of medicine, doing the right thing is actually the more difficult and complex thing to do, and we need to design systems that makes it the easiest thing to do, and not doing it becomes a hard thing.
I've got cushion. Let me nip around. There you go.
Although drug users are obviously highly disadvantaged and discriminated against, they're not the only group that can suffer a lack of dignity and respect in the healthcare system. Is there an opportunity for a bigger lesson for the health service and a bigger trial as to how that might be impacted?
So I think tackling stigma is a major challenge across the healthcare sector, across multiple diseases and areas. People are stigmatized for multiple different reasons, be that drug use, be that alcohol, be that obesity, sexual orientation, etc. We are working on it. It's a work in progress. I don't think there is a magic bullet, a magic wand. Building, we use the existing relationships that were less stigmatized as our into this. I don't think that we necessarily solve the stigma problem directly. But it's those trusting relationships that you defeat stigma by building the relationships with people and by breaking down the stereotypes in the healthcare professionals. And the medical school is working on that, but it is a work in progress, and we still need to keep pushing it. It's something the more we talk about it, the more we're aware of it, the more we'll be better at dealing with it.
Right, I'm going to shuffle along here. Take that mute off. So we're coming to a conclusion. You'll see on the screen there's a QR code handy here if you want to get a record for your CPD, and if you're online watching this, you can scan that in, go along, fill in the details. We will email you your certificate of attendance, and then we get to know who's been. You get a record for your appraisal. And speaking of which, I'm pleased to offer this certificate of recognition to Professor John Dillon in honour of his presentation at the Douglas G. Adamson Memorial Lecture, All Good Stories Need Research in the Pirate. I think you can take a photo and then upload it for your appraisal. Congratulations, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
So I understand there are some refreshments just out on the promenade, and if you have pre-registered if you haven't, then you might sneak in. But there is refreshments out there. You'll have a chance to speak to John and to the Adamson team, etc. And thanks again for you coming, and thanks everyone for being here. We'll see you again next week at Grand Rounds.